I still remember the first time I saw the trailer for CODA, and honestly, it didn't hit me like some big Hollywood event movie trying to grab attention with explosions or dramatic twists. It was quieter than that, almost unassuming. The kind of trailer you could scroll past if you weren't paying attention. And yet, something about it lingered. It opens in that small, coastal fishing town, early morning light hitting the water. Boats moving out like they've been doing the same routine for generations. There's this sense of repetition in the visuals. Nets, docks, cold air, tired faces. You don't even need dialogue to understand that this is a life built on labor more than dreams. And then you meet Ruby Rossi. She's in the middle of all of it, and yet slightly outside of it at the same time. A teenager waking up before school, already pulled into helping her family with the fishing business. The trailer doesn't rush her introduction. It just lets her exist in this environment where everything feels like obligation and love mixed together so tightly you can't separate them. And then very quickly, you notice something different about her home life. The way her parents and brother communicate isn't through spoken words. It's all sign language, facial expression, gestures that feel just as loud as dialogue in any other movie. Her family is deaf, and the trailer doesn't turn that into a dramatic reveal or a shock moment. It's just life for them. Normal, textured, lived-in life. What starts to stand out, though, is the imbalance Ruby is carrying. She's the CODA, child of deaf adults, and that idea becomes the emotional backbone of everything the trailer is hinting at. She's the interpreter between two worlds. At home, she translates for her family. At school, she tries to be just another teenager. And somewhere in between those spaces, you can feel this tension building, even in just a few seconds of footage. Then the tone shifts slightly when music enters the story. You see her in choir class, hesitant at first, almost like she wandered into the room by accident. The trailer doesn't present music as some magical escape right away. It feels more like curiosity, a teacher noticing something in her voice before she even notices it herself. And there's this subtle contrast the trailer keeps cutting between the silence of her home life and the emotional fullness of singing. That contrast is really where the trailer starts to breathe, because every time she sings, even briefly, the editing slows down. The sound design shifts. It's like the movie is letting the audience feel what she might be discovering internally. That her voice carries something her world at home cannot directly access. Not better, not worse, just different. And that difference is where the conflict quietly begins to form. There's a moment in the trailer where she's practicing singing, and her family is physically present, but emotionally separated from that experience. They can see her, they can feel her joy, but they can't hear what triggered it. That gap, that invisible wall, is where the entire emotional weight of the film starts to make itself known. And honestly, what struck me watching that trailer isn't just the premise, because on paper it sounds simple. Teen girl discovers singing, struggles between family responsibility and personal ambition. Hollywood has done versions of that story forever. But CODA doesn't sell it like a competition story or a fame arc. It feels smaller, more intimate, more grounded in actual human behavior rather than cinematic escalation. The trailer keeps pulling back to everyday gestures, hands signing across a kitchen table, a father joking in a way that only works if you're fully paying attention to facial expression, a brother teasing her in that sibling way that feels universal even without sound. And then, layered over that, you get these glimpses of her performing, her voice slowly becoming something that other people recognize as special. But instead of making it feel like she's leaving her family behind, the trailer keeps emphasizing how deeply she's tied to them. That's the tension that doesn't get resolved in 2 minutes of promotional editing. And honestly, it's what makes the movie feel like it has more weight than a typical coming-of-age drama. There's also something interesting in how the trailer frames the outside world. The school environment isn't exaggerated into some cruel or glamorous space. It's just normal. Classrooms, peers, awkward teenage interactions. But even in that normalcy, you can feel how different Ruby's internal experience is compared to everyone around her. She's constantly translating life, even when she's not literally signing. And then the music teacher character appears in the trailer, and the tone subtly shifts again. Not in a dramatic mentor way, not in a "you're destined for greatness" speech kind of cliche, but more like someone recognizing a talent and not fully understanding the weight attached to it. That's important, because the trailer avoids making him the center of her transformation. He's more like a doorway than a destination. What the trailer really does well is it keeps refusing easy emotional shortcuts. It doesn't over-explain the family dynamics. It doesn't sensationalize deafness. It doesn't turn singing into instant success fantasy. Everything feels earned, even in small glimpses. There's a shot in the trailer that sticks. Ruby standing between two spaces, literally framed between her home life and her outside life. And you can almost feel the psychological split without anyone saying a word about it. That's where the trailer starts to feel less like marketing and more like a promise of character-driven storytelling. And then, layered underneath all of that, is something quieter that you only really notice if you sit with it. This isn't just about ambition. It's about translation in every form. Translating words, translating emotions, translating responsibility, translating identity. The trailer doesn't spell that out, but it keeps circling it visually. Hands moving, voices unheard. Music felt more than shared. Silence, not as emptiness, but as a different kind of presence in the room. By the time the trailer ends, there's no grand resolution teased, no massive dramatic climax, just the sense that Ruby is standing at a point where she can't fully stay in one world without losing something from the other. And that's what makes it linger in your mind longer than expected. Because even without knowing the full story, you already understand the emotional math she's going to have to solve. And it's not clean. It's not something a teacher or a family conversation can fix in a single scene. It's the kind of internal conflict that stretches across time, across relationships, across identity itself. And maybe that's why CODA worked the way it did when people finally saw it. The trailer doesn't try to sell a spectacle. It quietly sets up a human pressure cooker, one that feels familiar even if your life looks nothing like Ruby Rossi's. It's not loud. It doesn't demand attention. It just sits with you and waits. Ruby's story, once the film actually starts unfolding, doesn't waste time trying to build some artificial big moment introduction. It just drops you straight into a life that already feels in motion, like you've walked into a house where everyone has been living the same routines for years. And what becomes clear almost immediately is that her mornings don't belong to her in the way they belong to most teenagers. Before school even enters the picture, she's already part of the family system that keeps the Rossi fishing business running. The boat, the sea, the early alarms, the physical exhaustion of work that doesn't pause for adolescence. It's all just there, baked into her identity. There's something very grounded about how the film handles that environment. It doesn't romanticize fishing life, but it doesn't degrade it either. It just shows it as inherited labor, a kind of generational rhythm where everyone has a role whether they chose it or not. Her father, Frank, and her brother, Leo, operate inside that rhythm with complete dependence on Ruby in ways they don't always consciously articulate, because for them, communication itself flows through her. That's one of the most quietly complex things about her situation. She isn't just a daughter or a sister. She's a translator of existence for her family. Every interaction with the outside world passes through her voice. Phone calls, negotiations, misunderstandings, emergencies. She's the bridge that keeps two realities from collapsing into confusion. And the film never treats that role as symbolic in a distant sense. It's physical. It's constant. It's tiring in a way you can almost feel in her posture. Then school becomes the contrast point, but not in the exaggerated two worlds colliding way that a lesser film might lean into. It's more subtle than that. At school, Ruby isn't extraordinary. She's not invisible either. She's just present, but undefined. Another student trying to keep up, trying to exist without drawing too much attention. The shift begins almost accidentally when she joins choir, not because she's chasing a dream yet, but because something about the structure of singing pulls her in. The way sound is organized, the way voices blend or clash. It's less about ambition at first and more about instinct. And what's interesting is how the film frames her discovery of her own voice. It doesn't treat it like a magical, hidden talent revealed moment. It feels more like she's stumbling into a part of herself that was always there, but never given space to surface. Her voice isn't suddenly perfect. It's uncertain, raw, but there's something emotionally honest in it that catches attention. Her choir teacher, Bernardo Villalobos, notices it not in a flashy cinematic way, but in that very real educator way. Someone who spent enough time around students to recognize when something slightly unusual is happening. He doesn't immediately push her towards stardom. He simply recognizes potential, and that recognition quietly shifts the direction of her life without announcing itself. But every step she takes toward that musical world creates a subtle imbalance at home. That's where the film starts to tighten emotionally, because at home, nothing has changed. Her family still depends on her in the same way they always have. The fishing business still requires her hands, her voice, her translation of the world. And that dependence isn't framed as toxic or oppressive in a simple way. It's affectionate, habitual, and deeply normalized. That's what makes it complicated. No one is the villain of her conflict. The situation itself is the pressure. You start noticing how often Ruby is interrupted, emotionally, not just physically. She'll be in the middle of something at school, something that belongs entirely to her, and then her phone buzzes, or someone from home needs her, or a situation arises that only she can mediate. And every time that happens, you feel the split deepen just a little more. What the film understands really well is that responsibility doesn't always feel like burden in the moment. Sometimes it feels like love. That's why it's so hard to question. There's a quiet emotional tension building in how Ruby begins to inhabit silence differently from her family. For them, silence is natural space. For her, silence is layered. It contains both her home world and her private world. Music exists inside that second layer, almost like a secret language she's slowly learning to trust. And when she starts practicing more seriously, there's a change not just in her ability, but in her awareness. She begins to hear herself differently, not just vocally, but internally. That shift is subtle, but it matters, because it marks the beginning of self-recognition. Meanwhile, her family continues operating with complete reliance on her presence, almost as if the structure of their daily life assumes she will always be there to translate, to explain, to bridge gaps that would otherwise become barriers. And they're not asking for anything unreasonable from their perspective. It's simply how life has functioned. That's what makes Ruby's growing independence so emotionally complex. It isn't rebellion. It isn't rejection, it's expansion. But expansion, in a system built on dependence, always creates friction. The film carefully avoids turning this into a simple choose your dream or your family narrative. Instead, it keeps tightening around the idea that she is the only shared access point between two worlds that don't fully overlap. And the more she steps into music, the more that overlap starts to feel unstable. There are moments where she tries to exist in both spaces at once, and you can almost feel the strain of that balancing act. Not in melodramatic breakdowns, but in exhaustion, in hesitation, in the small delays before she responds to something at home because part of her mind is still in rehearsal. What's really compelling is how the film treats communication itself as emotional weight. Because for Ruby, speaking isn't just speaking. It's translating intention, tone, context, emotion. It's interpreting life in real time. And when she sings, she steps into a form of expression that doesn't require translation. That difference becomes quietly intoxicating for her. But it also creates distance she didn't fully anticipate. The story keeps moving in this space between connection and separation, never fully tipping into one side. Even in scenes that could have been written as simple emotional arguments, there's restraint. People aren't yelling at each other in dramatic confrontations. They're misunderstanding each other in ways that feel more realistic and honestly more painful. Because misunderstanding in this story doesn't come from lack of love. It comes from love expressed through different systems of communication. And as Ruby's world starts to widen through music, the emotional cost of her role at home becomes harder to ignore. Not because it suddenly appears, but because she finally has something else to compare it to. That comparison is where everything begins to shift beneath the surface. The more time Ruby spends between these two worlds, the more the emotional geometry of her life starts to feel less like a simple balancing act and more like a structure under quiet strain. What's interesting is that nothing in her family changes in any obvious way. Frank still wakes up early, still goes out to the water, still approaches the fishing business with that stubborn, weathered persistence that comes from years of doing something, because it's the only thing that's always been there. Leo still carries himself with that mix of younger sibling energy and early responsibility, already learning the same routines, already stepping into the inherited rhythm of work. And her mother, Jackie, remains this deeply grounded presence, protective, expressive, emotionally intuitive, even without spoken language. The film does something subtle with her. She isn't written as distant or limited. She's emotionally sharp, often more perceptive than the people around her, and you can feel how much of the family's emotional center actually sits with her. But even with all of that stability, Ruby is shifting, and it's not a loud shift. It's almost invisible from the outside. That's what makes it dangerous in a very human way. Because life doesn't break all at once. It adjusts itself in small, almost unnoticeable increments until one day you realize the center of gravity has moved. At school, her relationship with music starts becoming more structured. Choir stops being something she's just trying out and starts turning into something that demands discipline. Breath control, pitch awareness, blending with others. It's technical, but also emotional in a way she doesn't fully have language for yet. There's something fascinating in how she experiences sound compared to everyone else in that room. For her classmates, music is immediate. For her, it feels almost constructed, like she's learning a system that exists parallel to the world she grew up translating. And that difference slowly becomes a kind of internal pull. The teacher pushes her gently, never in a way that feels exploitative. He doesn't treat her like a novelty or a project. He treats her like someone who might actually belong in a space she hasn't fully claimed yet. And that distinction matters because it prevents the story from sliding into cliche territory. But the real emotional pressure isn't coming from school. It's coming from what school represents. Freedom of time, freedom of attention, freedom from being constantly available. At home, Ruby's presence isn't just helpful, it's structural. When she's there, things move smoothly. When she's absent, even briefly, small cracks appear in communication. A missed call, a misunderstood instruction, a moment where something needs to be negotiated with the outside world and she isn't there to translate. It all creates friction that the family feels immediately. And what the film captures so well is how quickly responsibility becomes identity, not just for Ruby, but for her family's perception of her. She is the one who bridges everything. That role becomes so normalized that no one actively questions it, because questioning it would mean rethinking the entire way they functioned for years. There's a quiet emotional weight in watching Ruby begin to recognize that she is not just participating in her family's life. She is actively holding parts of it together that might otherwise struggle to function in the same way. And that realization doesn't come with anger. It comes with awareness, which is somehow heavier, because awareness doesn't automatically lead to resolution. There are moments where she tries to express what she's feeling, but language itself becomes complicated. How do you explain to a family that depends on your presence that you are discovering a part of yourself that exists outside of that dependence? Especially when that dependence was never presented as a trap, but as love, necessity, and shared survival. The film doesn't simplify that tension. It lets it sit. And that sitting space is where most of the emotional power lives. One of the most understated aspects of Ruby's experience is how she starts to feel time differently. At home, time is cyclical: work, sleep, repeat. At school, time is linear: progress, improvement, future. Those two structures don't naturally align, and she exists at the intersection of both. So even when nothing dramatic is happening, there's this underlying sense of acceleration in her personal life. Not because events are speeding up, but because her awareness is expanding faster than her environment is changing. That creates a kind of internal mismatch. And you can see it in how she starts making decisions without fully articulating them. Staying late for practice, hesitating before answering calls from home, sitting in silence a little longer after singing, like she's trying to understand what just happened inside her own voice. Meanwhile, her family continues operating with the same assumptions they've always had, not out of neglect, but out of continuity. In their world, Ruby is still fully embedded in the household system. The idea that she might be developing a parallel identity doesn't fully register yet, because from their perspective, nothing fundamental has shifted. That's what makes the emotional tension so layered. There's no villain, no rupture, no obvious confrontation point. Just a gradual divergence of perception. The film also does something very careful with humor. It doesn't break tension artificially, but it uses family interactions, especially between Ruby and Leo, to show how normal their bond is outside of the larger conflict. They tease each other, rely on each other, push each other in ways that feel lived in. It's not a family defined by struggle. It's a family defined by adaptation. And that's important because it prevents the story from reducing deafness to tragedy or inspiration. It's just their reality. The challenge isn't existence, it's intersection with the outside world. As Ruby grows more invested in singing, there's an increasing sense that she is developing a part of herself that doesn't have a clear place in her family's shared structure. not because they reject it, but because they cannot directly access it, and that creates a strange emotional gap. She can share everything with them except this. That gap becomes more noticeable in small moments. When she tries to describe rehearsal, when she comes home emotionally energized from singing, but has no way to translate what that feeling actually means in her household language. When she realizes that the joy she's experiencing doesn't have a direct equivalent in the world her family inhabits. It's not separation yet, but it's differentiation. And differentiation is the first real step toward change. What makes this middle stretch of the story so effective is that it refuses to dramatize the transition. There's no single breaking point, no big argument that resets everything. Instead, it's a slow accumulation of lived experience that starts pulling Ruby in a direction she can't fully ignore anymore. And even as that pull strengthens, her emotional loyalty to her family doesn't weaken in the opposite direction. That's the real complexity the film keeps returning to. She is not moving away from love. She is expanding within it. But expansion always changes shape. And shapes, once changed, don't return to their original form in quite the same way again. As Ruby continues moving deeper into her musical world, something subtle starts happening in the background of her life at home. It's not that her family becomes less important, it's that the rhythm between them begins to feel slightly out of sync, like two clocks still ticking correctly, but no longer perfectly aligned. She's still there in every physical sense, still helping on the boat, still translating conversations, still sitting at the kitchen table where so much of the Rossi family communication happens without sound. But emotionally, there are moments where she feels like she's arriving a half step late, even when she hasn't gone anywhere. That's the strange thing about growing into something new while still being essential to something old. You don't leave immediately. You start overlapping less cleanly. At school, her progress in choir becomes more noticeable. Not in a flashy, overnight transformation way, but in the way people around her begin to respond differently to her presence. Her voice carries more confidence. Not perfection, confidence. And that distinction matters because the film never tries to turn her into an effortless prodigy. She's still learning, still adjusting, still discovering what her voice actually wants to do when it isn't constrained by hesitation. Her teacher begins to challenge her more directly, pushing her toward solos, pushing her toward control, pushing her toward the idea that she might be capable of something beyond participation, something closer to expression as identity. And Ruby, even when she resists internally, can't ignore the way it feels when she sings and everything else falls away for a moment. That falling away feeling becomes important because it's the first space in her life where she is not translating for anyone. Not for her family, not for her classmates, not for the world around her. She is simply producing something that exists without interpretation. But every time she steps into that space, she steps out of another one. At home, the consequences of her absence aren't dramatic at first. They're logistical, missed communications, confusion during business interactions, small misunderstandings that would normally be smoothed out instantly if Ruby were present. And each of those moments reinforces how much invisible labor she has been carrying without anyone needing to explicitly name it. The film is careful here because it doesn't turn her family into dependent caricatures. They are competent, capable people operating within their own system. But that system has always included Ruby as a functional extension of their communication with the outside world. So when she isn't available, the system doesn't collapse. It just becomes less efficient, more fragmented, more exposed to friction. And that friction is felt emotionally, even when no one is blaming her. What starts to emerge in Ruby is not resentment, but awareness of scale. She begins to understand not just what she does for her family, but how consistently she does it. how constant her presence has been in bridging gaps she never really had time to notice as gaps. There's a quiet weight in realizing that your absence creates noticeable disruption in places you didn't realize you were holding together. At the same time, her connection to music continues to deepen in a way that feels increasingly internal. It stops being just an activity and starts becoming a language she is slowly acquiring fluency in. And fluency always changes perception. The more she understands sound, rhythm, and voice, the more she begins to notice how different that mode of expression is from the visual gestural language of her home life. Not better, not worse, just fundamentally different in how it structures emotion. And that difference begins to live inside her. There's a particular emotional tension the film handles very carefully. Ruby is not rejecting her family, and her family is not rejecting her. But both are slowly moving toward spaces of understanding that don't fully overlap. And instead of resolving that immediately, the story lets it stretch. Her parents especially begin to show signs of sensing change without fully being able to articulate what that change is. They notice her time shifting. They notice her attention divided. But they don't yet have a framework for understanding music as something that might eventually demand more than participation. It might demand identity. That's the unspoken pressure building underneath everything. And Ruby, caught between those worlds, starts to experience a kind of emotional doubling. When she's at home, part of her mind is still in rehearsal. When she's at rehearsal, part of her mind is still at home. Neither space fully contains her anymore, but she hasn't left either. That in-between state is where the film lives for a long stretch. What's especially striking is how ordinary everything remains on the surface. There are no exaggerated arguments, no sudden revelations that reset relationships overnight. Instead, conversations remain small, practical, and grounded in daily life. But underneath those conversations, there's a growing awareness that something irreversible is forming. Even her interactions with her brother Leo start to reflect this shift. There's still sibling closeness, still humor, still shared history, but also a faint sense that they are beginning to operate at slightly different emotional speeds. He is still firmly embedded in the family structure. Ruby is beginning to step partially outside it, even while remaining physically inside it, and neither of them fully knows how to talk about that without disrupting what they have. One of the most important emotional dynamics in this section of the story is that Ruby's growth is not framed as escape. It's framed as discovery. But discovery has consequences, especially when it reveals that your life contains more directions than the one you've been following by default. That realization doesn't create immediate conflict. It creates internal recalibration. And recalibration is slower than conflict, but often more transformative. The film keeps returning to small gestures to communicate all of this. The way Ruby pauses before responding to a call from home. The way she lingers after choir practice. The way she looks slightly different when she sings compared to when she's interpreting for her family. It's almost like she has different versions of herself that are becoming more distinct over time, not fragmented, just more defined. And definition is what eventually creates choice. Because at some point, even without a dramatic turning point, she starts to realize she cannot continue expanding in one direction without affecting the balance of the other. And that understanding sits quietly beneath everything she does moving forward. As that internal pressure settles deeper into Ruby's life, the film starts doing something very subtle with its emotional pacing. It stops introducing tension and starts letting you live inside it. You feel it most in the way ordinary days begin to carry double meaning. A simple morning at home is no longer just routine. It becomes a reminder of everything she is still responsible for. A simple afternoon at school is no longer just rehearsal or class time. It becomes a glimpse of a life that keeps expanding just beyond the reach of her current reality. And Ruby is right in the middle of both, without fully belonging to either in the way she used to. At home, her family's dependence on her doesn't suddenly increase, but it becomes more visible to her. That's an important distinction. The weight was always there. What changes is her perception of it. Once you start noticing the systems you're holding together, it becomes impossible to unsee them. Frank continues with the fishing business, carrying that quiet stubbornness of someone who has built his entire identity around physical labor and continuity. There's something almost old world about the way he operates. Work first, words second, survival through repetition. And Ruby has always been part of that repetition, not as an accessory, but as an essential connector between their world and everyone else's. Jackie, meanwhile, remains emotionally intuitive in a way that feels almost heightened without sound. She reads people through expression, timing, hesitation. There are moments where she senses Ruby shifting before anything is said out loud, even if she can't fully define what that shift means in concrete terms. That's where the film gets quietly powerful. It shows how understanding doesn't always require language, but interpretation still has limits, and those limits start to show. Ruby begins spending more time at choir, and with that, her identity outside the home starts to gain structure. She isn't just trying music anymore. She's building familiarity with it. The discipline of practice becomes familiar. The feedback loop of performance and correction becomes familiar. Even the discomfort of being pushed beyond what feels safe starts to feel like part of growth rather than risk. And slowly, something shifts in how she carries herself. It's not confidence in the traditional cinematic sense. It's more like internal alignment. She starts to recognize when she is in a space that feels like her own thinking, not just her own obligation. But the cost of that alignment is time. Time that was previously distributed evenly between school and home now begins to tilt. And that tilt is felt immediately at home, even if no one directly confronts it. Phone calls that she used to answer instantly now come with slight delays. Small moments of confusion arise when she isn't there to clarify something on the spot. The family adapts, as they always have. But adaptation still requires friction. And friction, even in loving systems, accumulates. What the film does so well here is avoid turning that accumulation into blame. No one sits down and declares dissatisfaction in a dramatic way. Instead, you see it in glances, pauses, small recalibrations in how people respond when Ruby isn't immediately available. And Ruby notices those changes too. That's the part that weighs on her most. Not guilt, in a simplified sense, but awareness of impact. She starts to understand that her absence doesn't just create inconvenience. It creates silence where there used to be instant translation. And silence, in her family's world, has a different emotional texture than in hers. At school, meanwhile, her musical world begins to stretch slightly further. There are conversations about potential, about where her voice might go if she continues developing it seriously. Not in a fantasy sense, but in a practical, grounded way that starts to hint at opportunity rather than just exploration. But opportunity always arrives with timing attached. And timing, for Ruby, is the central complication of everything. Because every step forward in music is a step that requires time she has previously reserved for her family. And every step back toward home is a step away from something that is beginning to define her in ways she didn't anticipate. That's the emotional geometry the film keeps tightening. Not a straight line, not a clean fork in the road, but overlapping obligations that don't neatly resolve into one direction. There are moments where Ruby tries to explain what she's feeling, but even those conversations don't land in a way that fully captures the complexity. Because how do you explain that something you love is expanding your world while simultaneously changing your availability to the people who shaped it? It's not conflict in the traditional sense. It's reconfiguration. And reconfiguration is harder to talk about because it doesn't have a clear right or wrong side. Her family, for their part, continues to operate within the assumption that Ruby's role is stable. Not because they are blind to her growth, but because their life structure has never required questioning that role before. She has always been there. She has always translated. She has always bridged. That continuity creates comfort, but also expectation. And expectation is where pressure quietly forms. One of the most emotionally nuanced aspects of this stretch of the story is how Ruby herself begins to experience pride and burden at the same time. Pride in her growing ability as a singer, in the recognition she's starting to receive, in the sense that she might be capable of something beyond what she originally imagined for herself. And burden in understanding that every step toward that possibility is also a step that complicates the balance of her home life. Those two feelings don't cancel each other out. They coexist. And coexistence is where emotional complexity lives. The film resists turning her into someone who is torn cleanly in half. Instead, she becomes someone who is constantly negotiating presence. Where is she fully present? Where is she partially present? Where is she physically present, but mentally elsewhere? Those questions don't get answered immediately because they aren't meant to. They accumulate. And as they accumulate, Ruby starts to realize that she is not just moving between two worlds. She is slowly becoming someone who has to decide how much of herself each world can actually hold. That realization doesn't arrive with drama. It arrives with silence. As Ruby starts carrying that awareness more constantly, something interesting happens in the way she moves through both spaces, home and school. Stop feeling like separate places she enters and exits, and start feeling more like competing demands on the same version of herself. It shows up in the smallest details first. The way she answers before fully processing. The way she pauses longer than usual before responding to something at home. The way she sits in choir rehearsal and still has half her attention tethered somewhere else. Like her mind is split between two conversations happening in different rooms. And the film never underlines it. It just lets you notice it the way you notice real changes in someone you know over time. At home, the Rossi family continues to function the way it always has, but Ruby's shifting availability subtly changes the rhythm. Frank still relies on her to handle communication with buyers and outsiders. Jackie still depends on her to interpret situations that move too fast for sign alone in public-facing environments. Leo still leans on her in that sibling way where she is both partner and buffer between him and the wider world. None of that dependence is new. What's new is Ruby's perception of it. Because once you become aware of how essential you are to a system, it stops feeling neutral. It starts feeling like weight, even if nobody is placing it there intentionally. And that's where the emotional complexity deepens, because no one in her family is asking her to stop growing. But the system they've built together doesn't automatically adjust for her growth either. That gap creates tension without confrontation. Meanwhile, her life at school continues to open in ways she didn't fully anticipate when she first joined choir. What started as curiosity is now beginning to resemble trajectory. Her teacher pushes her further, not with pressure in a harsh sense, but with expectation shaped by recognition. He hears something in her voice that suggests potential beyond casual participation. And Ruby, for the first time, starts to experience what it feels like when someone outside her family sees her as something other than a translator or support system. That shift matters more than it seems on the surface, because at home, her identity is deeply tied to function. She is needed. She is relied upon. She is part of a living structure that depends on her consistency. At school, she is something closer to undefined potential, not yet fixed, not yet assigned a permanent role. And being undefined can feel like freedom, but it can also feel like instability if you're used to being necessary. The film doesn't rush that psychological adjustment. It lets Ruby sit in it. Sometimes she leans into music fully, letting herself be absorbed by it. Other times, she pulls back, almost reflexively, as if remembering the weight of what she temporarily stepped away from. That push and pull becomes the emotional engine of this section of the story. And what's particularly effective is how ordinary everything continues to look on the surface. There's no dramatic visual signal that her life is changing. No sudden rupture. Just daily repetition, gradually taking on new meaning. Even conversations at home remain grounded and familiar. But Ruby starts hearing them differently now. Not because the words have changed, but because her attention is no longer fully anchored in them the way it used to be. That creates a strange emotional dissonance, being present, but not entirely contained. At school, music starts demanding a different kind of discipline. Not just talent, but consistency. Practice outside of structured time. Attention to detail. Emotional investment in performance. And as she begins to respond to that demand, the time she has available for her family naturally becomes more fragmented. And fragmentation is where things begin to feel unstable. Her family doesn't respond with anger or confrontation because from their perspective, nothing has fundamentally changed about Ruby's role. She still shows up. She still helps. She still translates. But what they don't fully see is how much internal negotiation is happening every time she decides where to be emotionally present. That internal negotiation is exhausting in a way that isn't immediately visible to others. And the film is careful not to dramatize that exhaustion as breakdown. It's quieter than that. It shows up in hesitation, in timing, in the small delay between request and response. One of the most interesting emotional threads here is how Ruby begins to experience autonomy, not as separation from her family, but as expansion of self. And expansion, by definition, doesn't immediately reduce connection, but it changes how connection operates. She still loves her family. That never becomes questionable. But love alone doesn't determine structure. Structure is built from time, attention, and shared systems of communication. And Ruby is starting to redistribute those elements, even if unintentionally. That redistribution is where tension forms, not as conflict, but as mismatch. There's also something quietly profound about how the film continues to treat silence. For Ruby's family, silence is not absence. It's their native communication space. But for Ruby, silence is layered. It contains both her family life and her internal musical life. Two entirely different meanings occupying the same sensory space. So when she sings, she isn't leaving silence behind. She is repurposing it. And that repurposing begins to reshape how she understands herself. At this point in the story, Ruby isn't making a single defining choice. She's accumulating experiences that will eventually make a choice unavoidable. And that accumulation is what gives this section its emotional tension. Because nothing is breaking yet, but everything is leaning. And leaning structures don't fail suddenly. They shift until balance becomes a question rather than a default. That's exactly where she is now, standing in a life that still looks intact from the outside, while internally beginning to understand that she is no longer evenly distributed across it, and that understanding, once it fully settles in, changes everything that comes next. As that realization settles in, Ruby doesn't suddenly transform into someone different. That's not how the film treats her. Instead, she becomes more aware of the weight she's been carrying for years, without ever labeling it as weight. And awareness, once it arrives, doesn't just sit quietly. It starts rewriting how every ordinary moment feels. At home, the Rossi household continues its familiar rhythm. Early mornings, fishing work, communication that flows through Ruby almost automatically. Frank still expects her presence in moments where dealing with the outside world is involved. Jackie still trusts her instinctively when interpretation is needed. Leo still leans on her in that sibling way where she is both equal and mediator. But now Ruby notices every instance of that reliance with a kind of double vision. She sees the moment as it is, and she also sees what it costs her in real time. That doesn't mean she resents her family. The film never pushes her into that simplified emotional space. Instead, it shows something more complicated, love that remains intact while structure begins to strain. And that strain doesn't explode. It accumulates quietly. Meanwhile, her life in music continues to expand, not dramatically, but steadily. Choir practice becomes less like an extracurricular activity and more like a space where she feels increasingly fluent in a language that doesn't require translation. She doesn't have to interpret herself for anyone in that room. She just exists through sound. That difference is subtle, but it starts to matter more with each passing day. Her teacher continues to encourage her, pushing her toward fuller expression, not in a way that isolates her from others, but in a way that reveals how much more she can do than she originally assumed. And for Ruby, that encouragement doesn't land as pressure. It lands as recognition, something she isn't used to outside her family context. Because at home, recognition looks different. It's functional. You are valued because you are needed. At school, recognition is exploratory. You are seen because of what you might become. That contrast begins to reshape her internal sense of identity. And slowly, without her consciously deciding it, she begins to spend more of herself in places where she is not essential to someone else's survival. That shift changes everything about how time feels. Time at home feels more compressed now, like it has obligations embedded in every minute. Time at school feels more open, but also less anchored, as if it could expand indefinitely if she lets it. And she is constantly moving between those two experiences. One of the most emotionally important developments here is how Ruby starts to recognize the emotional labor embedded in her role at home, not as something imposed on her, but as something she grew into so naturally that it became invisible until now. That invisibility is what makes it complicated, because nothing about it is wrong in a moral sense. It's just deeply ingrained. And deeply ingrained systems are the hardest to question. There are moments where she begins to feel the weight of timing more sharply than anything else. Not just what she does, but when she does it. Being slightly late to one space because she was fully present in another starts to carry emotional consequences she didn't previously register. And that creates a constant internal negotiation that runs underneath everything else. At home, she becomes slightly more aware of how much communication depends on her immediate availability. A missed cue doesn't just delay information, it changes how smoothly interactions unfold. That realization doesn't create guilt in a simple sense, but it does create awareness of fragility. At school, she becomes more aware of how rare it is to be in a space where she is not structurally necessary to someone else's functioning. That freedom is unfamiliar, and unfamiliar freedom always carries a kind of emotional uncertainty. So she exists in a growing tension between necessity and possibility. Neither side feels wrong. Both feel real. And that's what makes her situation so grounded. The film continues to resist simplifying her emotional arc into a single direction. Instead, it lets her accumulate moments of clarity that don't immediately resolve into action. She understands more, but understanding does not immediately translate into decision. That delay between awareness and action is where most of her internal story lives. Her relationships at home begin to reflect that subtle shift as well. Conversations remain normal on the surface, but Ruby's internal engagement changes. She is still present, still participating, but there's an additional layer of observation now. She is no longer only inside the system, she is also watching it. As that understanding settles deeper into Ruby's day-to-day life, something quieter but more permanent begins to happen. She stops experiencing her world as one continuous flow and starts experiencing it as two overlapping systems that don't fully translate into each other anymore. And she is the point where they intersect. At home, nothing has changed in any obvious structural way, but the emotional atmosphere has subtly adjusted around her awareness. Frank still operates within the same expectations of work and survival. Jackie still holds the emotional center of the family with that steady, observant presence. Leo is still learning the same routines, still absorbing the inherited logic of their life. But Ruby is no longer moving through that system unconsciously. She notices now. She notices how quickly communication breaks down when she isn't there. She notices how often her presence is assumed rather than requested. She notices how deeply embedded she is in the functioning of situations that no one ever explicitly asked her to carry alone, but that she naturally absorbed anyway. And noticing changes everything, even if nothing externally shifts yet, because awareness turns routine into structure, and structure can be evaluated. At school, the contrast continues to widen in a different direction. Music is no longer just something she participates in. It is becoming something she invests in emotionally, physically, and mentally. Choir is not simply an activity. It is a space where she experiences herself without mediation. That difference becomes more and more emotionally significant. At home, she is always interpreted through necessity. At school, she is beginning to exist through expression. And expression, unlike necessity, doesn't require her to disappear into function. There's a growing internal awareness that she cannot fully inhabit both roles at maximum capacity without something becoming strained. Not broken, not lost, but strained. Held at a tension that requires constant adjustment. And constant adjustment is exhausting in a way that builds slowly rather than suddenly. The film handles this exhaustion with restraint. It never dramatizes her fatigue into collapse or breakdown. Instead, it shows it through timing, how long it takes her to respond, how quickly she has to shift emotional states, how frequently she is mentally transitioning between two different modes of being. One mode is relational and interpretive. The other is expressive and self-contained. Switching between those modes repeatedly starts to cost something she can feel, but not easily articulate. At home, her role as interpreter remains central, but now it carries an additional layer of awareness. She understands not just what she is saying, but what she is enabling. Every translation is no longer just communication, it is structural maintenance. And that realization adds weight to even the most ordinary interactions. At school, her musical development continues in a way that feels increasingly like internal alignment rather than external achievement. She begins to understand what her voice can do when it is not filtered through hesitation or divided attention. Singing becomes less about performance for others and more about experiencing sound as personal expression. And that experience is something her home life cannot directly access with her. That creates a gap, not emotional distance, but experiential separation. She is living something that cannot be fully shared in the same form with the people she is closest to. And that kind of separation is uniquely complicated because it doesn't come from conflict. It comes from difference. The film resists simplifying that difference into a moral choice. It never frames her family as something she must escape, nor does it frame her music as something she must abandon. Instead, it keeps reinforcing the idea that both are valid systems of meaning that operate under different conditions. And Ruby is beginning to realize she cannot be fully optimized for both at the same time. Not because she lacks ability, but because time is finite, attention is finite, and emotional presence cannot be duplicated without consequence. There are moments where this begins to surface in small behavioral shifts. She becomes slightly more deliberate in how she chooses where to be fully present. She starts to recognize that even small decisions, staying a few extra minutes at rehearsal, answering a call from home immediately versus after practice, carry emotional ripple effects in both directions. And those ripples don't cancel each other out. They accumulate. At home, her family continues to rely on her presence in ways that feel normal to them because they have always functioned this way. Not out of expectation in a demanding sense, but out of habit built over years. Ruby is the interface between their world and the external one. At school, she is beginning to become something closer to an individual voice within a collective space. And those two identities don't conflict directly, but they don't naturally merge either. That tension begins to define her internal rhythm. There's a growing sense that she is approaching a point where she can no longer operate purely on instinctive responsiveness. She will need to make conscious decisions about distribution, of time, of energy, of attention. And conscious distribution always introduces emotional consequence, because choosing where to be fully present inevitably means choosing where you are partially absent. The film doesn't rush this realization into action. It lets Ruby live inside it. It lets her continue functioning while understanding more than she did before. And that combination, functioning with awareness, is where the emotional pressure quietly builds. Nothing is falling apart, but nothing is fully stable in the way it used to be either. And that space in between is where everything meaningful in her story is starting to take shape. By this point, Ruby's life has started to feel like it's being measured less in days and more in decisions she doesn't always realize she's making until after they've already shaped something. And that's where the emotional texture of CODA becomes really interesting. It stops presenting her situation as a series of big turning points, and instead lets it exist as a constant negotiation between presence and absence. At home, the Rossi family continues to function with the same grounded rhythm, but Ruby's awareness of that rhythm has changed. She sees now how much of it flows through her without interruption, almost like she is part of the infrastructure rather than just a member of the family. Frank's world is still defined by work that demands physical endurance and repetition. Jackie's world is still defined by emotional perception through visual and tactile communication. Leo is still stepping into adulthood through the same inherited labor system. And Ruby is still the bridge. But what changes is how she experiences being that bridge. It used to feel automatic. Now it feels active. That shift alone is enough to start reshaping her internal emotional balance. Because when something becomes visible that used to be invisible, it stops feeling effortless. At school, her musical identity continues to develop in ways that feel increasingly separate from her home identity, not in opposition, but in autonomy. Choir is becoming a place where she is not required to translate anything for anyone else. She is not responsible for anyone else's understanding. She is simply part of a shared sound, and that shared sound starts to become a kind of emotional release she doesn't fully have anywhere else. Not escape, release. That distinction matters, because escape implies leaving something behind. Release implies letting something move through you without needing to carry it further. And Ruby begins to recognize that singing gives her access to a version of herself that isn't structured around responsibility. That realization doesn't create conflict yet, but it creates contrast. And contrast is what begins to change perception over time. The more she experiences that contrast, the more she becomes aware of how much of her life has been structured around immediate responsiveness. At home, she responds. She interprets. She adjusts. She translates. Those actions are so embedded in her identity that they don't feel like tasks. They feel like natural extensions of being part of the family. But now, because she has another space where she exists differently, those extensions begin to feel like roles rather than reflexes. And once a role is recognized as a role, it can no longer remain unquestioned in the same way. The film is very careful not to turn this into resentment. Ruby doesn't start pulling away emotionally from her family. That's not the direction of her internal shift. Instead, she becomes more aware of proportionality, how much of her time, energy, and attention is distributed across different parts of her life. And that awareness is new. At home, small moments begin to carry more meaning for her than they used to. A missed cue in communication, a situation that requires her immediate interpretation, a moment where her absence briefly slows something down. None of these are dramatic events on their own, but together they form a pattern she can now clearly see. And seeing patterns changes how you feel inside them. At school, her progression in music is also not framed as sudden success. It's incremental. It's shaped by repetition, correction, refinement. But what changes is her relationship to effort. She starts to experience effort not just as obligation, but as investment in something that belongs to her. And that feeling is unfamiliar enough to be emotionally significant, because so much of her life has been defined by effort directed outward, toward maintaining, supporting, translating, enabling. Now some of that effort is turning inward, and that inward turn creates emotional recalibration. The tension in her life doesn't come from a single decision point. It comes from the accumulation of two fully valid modes of existence that require different kinds of attention. At home, attention is distributed outward constantly. At school, attention is increasingly internalized, and switching between those modes repeatedly starts to feel like a constant rebalancing act she is performing without pause. The film doesn't dramatize this as breakdown. It presents it as lived experience. There are moments where she is physically in one place, but emotionally partially anchored in the other. Not because she is distracted, but because both spaces now hold real emotional weight for her. That dual anchoring creates a kind of internal tension that doesn't resolve easily. Her family continues to function without explicit awareness of how much internal change is happening for her. They notice surface level shifts, time, availability, attention, but they don't yet fully understand the internal reorganization that is happening beneath those shifts. And Ruby herself is still in the process of understanding it. She is not rejecting her role in the family. She is not abandoning responsibility. She is beginning to recognize that responsibility and identity are no longer perfectly overlapping in the way they once were. And that recognition is subtle but irreversible. Because once you understand that you contain more than one fully valid version of yourself operating in different contexts, you can no longer reduce your life to a single function without feeling that reduction. And Ruby is starting to feel that. Not as conflict, but as awareness that is slowly reshaping how she understands what she is becoming. As Ruby moves further into that awareness, the story starts to feel less like it's adding new events and more like it's peeling back how much emotional work has been underneath her life all along without anyone ever naming it. And that's where CODA quietly gets sharper. It makes you realize nothing about her situation is new. What's new is her ability to see it. At home, the Rossi family's world still operates with that same lived-in rhythm. Frank is still tied to the sea in a way that feels less like a job and more like inherited gravity. Jackie continues to manage the emotional and practical flow of the household with instinct and experience. Leo is still stepping into responsibility that mirrors his father's path, learning through repetition rather than explanation. And Ruby is still there in all of it. But now, she is also aware of how central she is to its smooth operation. That awareness doesn't change her actions immediately, but it changes how those actions feel internally. Helping is no longer just helping, it is coordination. Translation is no longer just communication, it is structural alignment between two worlds that don't naturally speak the same language. And once you start seeing your role that way, it becomes harder to experience it as invisible. At school, her musical life continues developing in a way that feels increasingly self-directed. Choir is no longer something she stumbled into. It has become something she actively returns to, not just because she enjoys it, but because it offers her a space where she is not constantly managing someone else's access to meaning. In that space, she doesn't interpret, she expresses. And that difference becomes emotionally significant in ways she doesn't fully articulate out loud, but definitely feels internally. Her voice, at this stage, is no longer just being discovered, it's being refined. And refinement requires repetition, correction, time, all of which begin to compete more directly with the time she spends at home. But the film never frames that competition as dramatic conflict. It's quieter. It shows up in scheduling, in timing, in small adjustments that slowly shift the balance of her days. And those shifts are cumulative. At home, there's still no rejection of her growing involvement in music. Her family doesn't oppose it. In fact, there's a kind of pride that exists alongside their reliance on her. But pride and dependency don't cancel each other out. They coexist in a way that can still generate pressure without intention. That's part of what Ruby is starting to feel more clearly now. Not pressure from demand, but pressure from structure. Because the structure of their family life has always included her as a central function. And functions are hard to partially step away from without affecting the system they support. What's interesting is that Ruby doesn't frame her growing musical identity as a departure from her family. She doesn't think in those binary terms. Instead, she experiences it as expansion. But expansion, even when positive, changes how distribution works. Time gets redistributed. Attention gets redistributed. Emotional presence gets redistributed. And redistribution always creates imbalance somewhere, even if nothing is being taken away intentionally. The film stays grounded in how ordinary this all looks externally, There are no dramatic confrontations marking each shift. Instead, it's all embedded in daily behavior. A slightly delayed response here, a missed moment there, a quiet recalibration in how quickly she can switch between emotional states depending on where she is. And that switching becomes more noticeable to her than anyone else, because she is the only one living both systems simultaneously from the inside. At school, her relationship with music becomes increasingly embodied. It stops being something she goes to and starts becoming something she steps into. And that distinction matters because it changes how present she feels when she is singing. There's a kind of emotional clarity that begins to appear when she is fully engaged in performance. Not escape, but alignment. Like all the parts of her attention are finally pointed in the same direction. And that feeling stands in contrast to her experience at home, where attention is always split between immediate interaction and background responsibility. That contrast doesn't create rejection. It creates awareness of difference. And difference is what begins to shape her internal conflict, not as conflict between good and bad choices, but between two meaningful forms of belonging that require different versions of herself. One version is relational, interpretive, deeply embedded in family structure. The other is expressive, individual, increasingly self-defined. And both are real. And both are active at the same time. That simultaneity is what makes her situation emotionally complex, because she is not transitioning from one identity to another. She is inhabiting both, and gradually realizing that inhabiting both at full capacity may not be sustainable without adjustment, but she hasn't yet defined what that adjustment would look like. So she continues living inside the tension. The film doesn't rush her toward resolution. It lets her accumulate experience. It lets her feel the friction between systems without forcing immediate decisions. And that accumulation is important because it reflects something very human. Understanding often arrives long before action does. Ruby understands more now than she did earlier in the story. She understands her role. She understands her family's dependency structure. She understands her own growing independence. But understanding doesn't automatically reorganize a life. It just makes the existing structure more visible. And once something becomes visible, it starts asking to be acknowledged. Not loudly, but persistently. And that persistence is where everything is quietly heading next. By now, Ruby is living in a kind of emotional overlap that never fully shuts off. Even when she's physically settled in one place, part of her awareness is always tracking the other. At home, that means she's present, but not entirely unburdened by awareness of how much depends on her presence. At school, that means she's focused, but still tethered, in a quieter way, to the family structure that shaped her sense of responsibility long before she ever thought about music as a path. And what's interesting is that nothing about her family's behavior changes in a sudden way to trigger this. Frank doesn't suddenly become more demanding. Jackie doesn't suddenly become more dependent. Leo doesn't suddenly shift roles. Everything stays within the same long-established rhythm. But Ruby has changed in how she perceives that rhythm. That's the key shift the film keeps returning to without ever over-explaining it. Because once you start noticing the mechanics of your own life, you can't return to not noticing them. At school, her musical world continues to open up in ways that feel increasingly structured around potential rather than participation. Choir is no longer just an activity she attends. It's a space where her voice is being shaped with intention. She is being guided, corrected, pushed, refined. And each of those processes slowly builds a sense that what she is doing there is not temporary, it's directional. That word, Directional is what quietly changes everything, because direction implies movement towards something that exists beyond the current moment. And once a life starts to feel directional in one area, it naturally creates contrast with areas that feel static. At home, life is not static in a negative sense. It's consistent, cyclical, grounded in routine and necessity. But consistency and direction are not the same experience internally. One is maintenance, the other is development. And Ruby is beginning to feel both at the same time. The emotional complexity here is that neither world is asking her to choose. No one is forcing a decision. There is no dramatic ultimatum, no confrontation that demands immediate resolution. Instead, she exists in a space where both worlds continue operating under the assumption that she is fully available. And she is, but only in parts. That partial availability is where the tension lives. Because she is learning, almost quietly, that presence is not binary. You can be physically present and emotionally divided. You can be emotionally present and structurally unavailable. You can be both, but not always at full intensity in both directions at the same time. And that realization is slowly changing how she experiences everyday life. There are moments at home where she reacts slightly slower than she used to, not because she cares less, but because her attention has become more layered. Part of her is always processing something from another environment, a rehearsal detail, a musical correction, a sense of timing that belongs to a different rhythm than the one at the kitchen table. And those layers don't conflict directly. They coexist, but they also compete for immediacy. At school, something similar happens in reverse. She can be fully immersed in music, fully engaged in sound and structure, but there is still an underlying awareness of time passing in another part of her life. A missed call, a situation she might need to translate later, a responsibility waiting in a different context. That dual awareness becomes the emotional signature of this stage of her life. The film is very careful not to dramatize it into crisis. Instead, it presents it as a kind of sustained, cognitive, and emotional load that builds through repetition rather than incident. And repetition, over time, changes perception. One of the most important developments here is how Ruby starts to understand that her role in her family is not just emotional, it's infrastructural. She is part of how their interaction with the external world functions. Not as a helper in the casual sense, but as an integrated system component. That realization is not framed as resentment, it's framed as clarity. And clarity can be heavier than emotion because it removes ambiguity. At school, her progress in music continues to reinforce the idea that she is moving towards something that is hers alone, not separate from her family in a rejection sense, but separate in authorship. Her voice belongs to her in a way her role at home does not fully allow. And that distinction begins to matter more with time, because authorship implies ownership of direction. And ownership of direction eventually demands decisions about where time and attention are invested. The film continues to avoid pushing her toward an immediate decision point. Instead, it lets her continue living in the overlap. It lets her feel the increasing pressure of two valid worlds that require different forms of presence. And that pressure doesn't break her, it reshapes her awareness. She begins to see that she is not just managing two parts of her life, she is actively balancing two identities that were formed under different conditions of need, expression, and expectation. And balancing identities is not a stable long-term state. It is a transition state. The emotional power of this section comes from how ordinary everything remains, while everything internally becomes more defined. There are no dramatic external markers signaling transformation, just increasing internal clarity. And clarity, once it arrives, doesn't stay passive. It begins to influence what comes next, even before anything outwardly changes. And that influence is starting to quietly accumulate. As that internal clarity continues to build, Ruby starts moving through her days with a kind of quiet, dual awareness that never really turns off anymore. It's not confusion, it's recognition. Recognition that her life has already split into two meaningful directions, even if she hasn't formally chosen between them. At home, everything still feels familiar on the surface. The kitchen, the morning routines, the fishing schedule, the way communication flows through her without anyone needing to think about it too deeply. Frank still relies on her to handle the outside world. Jackie still trusts her instinctively in situations that require translation. Leo still orbits around her presence in that sibling way where she is both companion and stabilizer. Nothing about that structure has changed, but Ruby has changed inside it. And that internal shift is subtle enough that most of the household would describe things as normal, even while Ruby experiences them as increasingly layered. She is still participating fully, but now she is also aware of participation itself. That awareness is what changes the emotional weight of everything she does. At school, her life in music continues to grow in a way that feels increasingly structured around potential she can now clearly sense in herself. Choir is no longer just a class or activity. It's becoming a place where she experiences a version of herself that doesn't exist anywhere else in her life. Not because it replaces her home identity, but because it activates a different part of her. In that space, she is not interpreting anyone else's world. She is producing something directly. Sound, expression, timing, all of it belongs to her in a way that doesn't require translation. And that ownership of expression is something she is not used to carrying. It starts to create a quiet emotional contrast that grows more noticeable with repetition. The more time she spends singing, the more she becomes aware of how different it feels compared to her role at home. At home, she is constantly oriented outward, toward others' needs, communication gaps, situational clarity. At school, she is increasingly oriented inward, toward voice, technique, expression, personal growth. Neither orientation is new in human terms, but the balance between them is new for her. And balance, once you become aware of it, stops feeling automatic. It becomes something you maintain. That maintenance is what begins to subtly reshape her internal experience of time. Days no longer feel like a single continuous flow. They feel segmented, home time and school time, each with its own emotional demands, its own mental posture. And switching between those postures repeatedly starts to carry a kind of invisible cost. Not dramatic fatigue, more like accumulated adjustment. The film stays very grounded in how this shows up externally. There are no exaggerated signs, just small behavioral shifts, a pause before responding, a moment of mental recalibration when moving from one environment to another, slight delays in emotional availability depending on where she is. And over time, those small shifts start to form a pattern she can no longer ignore. One of the more important emotional realizations happening here is that Ruby is not becoming less connected to her family. She is becoming more aware of how connection is structured. And structure always implies roles. At home, her role has always been clearly defined, even if it was never explicitly named. She is the interpreter, the connector, the bridge. That role has emotional depth, history, and love embedded in it, but it is still a role. At school, her identity is less defined and more emergent. She is a singer in development, a voice being shaped, a student moving towards something not yet fully formed. And that difference between defined role and emergent identity is where the emotional tension quietly lives, because defined roles are stable but limiting. Emergent identity is expansive but uncertain, and Ruby is now experiencing both simultaneously. The film doesn't push her toward rejecting one for the other. Instead, it lets her feel the strain of existing in both without immediate resolution. At home, the family continues to operate without conscious awareness of how much internal restructuring is happening within her. They notice surface level changes, availability, timing, attention, but not the deeper shift in how Ruby is beginning to perceive her own life. And Ruby herself is still processing it in real time. She hasn't yet turned her awareness into a decision. She is still living inside it. At school, music continues to function as a space of increasing clarity for her. Not clarity in the sense of answers, but clarity in the sense of self-perception. She begins to understand what it feels like to shape something that is entirely hers from the inside out. And that feeling is not just satisfying, it is revealing. Because once you experience yourself outside of a role that others depend on, you start to recognize how much of your identity has been structured around that dependency. That recognition doesn't create rejection, it creates perspective. And perspective is what slowly begins to shift everything underneath her choices, even before she makes any overt changes. There's a growing sense that Ruby is standing at a threshold that isn't marked by a single event, but by accumulation of awareness, of contrast, of internal differentiation. And thresholds like that don't announce themselves. They become visible only after you've already been standing on them for a while. And that's exactly where she is now, inside a life that still looks the same from the outside, but no longer feels the same from within. At this point in Ruby's life, the most important changes aren't happening around her. They're happening in how she processes everything around her. And that difference is quiet, but it's irreversible. At home, the Rossi family still functions within its long-established rhythm. Frank continues to wake before dawn, tied to the sea in that way people sometimes are when work becomes identity rather than just livelihood. Jackie maintains the emotional and practical flow of the household with an instinct that doesn't require spoken language. Leo continues to grow into the same working structure, absorbing it the way younger siblings often absorb the world they are raised in. And Ruby is still part of all of it, but now she is also observing it while participating in it. That dual position, inside and aware at the same time, is what changes everything without needing external disruption. She begins to notice how often her presence is assumed rather than negotiated, not in a negative way, not as demand, but as structure. The family's interaction with the outside world has, over time, naturally come to depend on her immediate availability. Phone calls, business interactions, misunderstandings, timing issues, all of it flows through her. And she can see that now with a clarity she didn't have before. At school, her life in music continues to evolve with a different kind of structure. Choir is no longer just participation or curiosity. It is discipline, repetition, correction, refinement. Her voice is being shaped through practice, but also through attention. Attention she gives freely, without the same embedded obligation she feels at home. And that difference in obligation becomes emotionally significant. Because obligation and choice feel completely different internally, even when the external action looks similar. At home, much of what Ruby does is reactive. Something happens, she responds. A need appears, she fills it. A conversation requires translation, she becomes the conduit. At school, especially in music, her actions are increasingly proactive. She chooses to engage. She chooses to refine. She chooses to repeat, adjust, improve. And that shift from reaction to intention is where her internal world starts to reorganize itself. Not dramatically, not suddenly, but steadily. There are moments where she becomes aware of how rare it is in her home environment to act without immediate relational consequence. In music, she can practice something simply because she wants to improve it. At home, most actions are tied directly to someone else's need or situation. That contrast begins to matter more than she fully articulates. And the more she notices it, the more her emotional bandwidth starts to feel divided in a way that isn't about conflict, but about allocation. She begins to understand that attention is not infinite, and where attention goes, emotional presence follows. This is where the film becomes especially grounded. It never turns her realization into melodrama. There is no sudden declaration, no breaking point where everything is forced into confrontation. Instead, her life continues in parallel tracks that slowly diverge in experience even while remaining physically connected. At home, she still cares deeply. That never changes. Her emotional attachment to her family is not in question, and the film is careful not to undermine that bond for the sake of narrative tension. But care and structure are not the same thing. And structure is what begins to feel increasingly visible to her. At school, her musical development is beginning to hint at something beyond participation. Not fame, not instant transformation, but trajectory. The idea that her voice might have a path that extends beyond the immediate moment. And trajectory introduces time in a different way. Because once you begin thinking in terms of trajectory, you start to imagine future states of yourself that require different allocations of attention than your current life fully supports. And that is where tension begins to form internally, not between people, but between versions of self. The version of Ruby that exists at home is defined by connection and responsibility. The version of Ruby that exists in music is defined by expression and growth. Both are real. Both are active. Both require time, but time cannot be duplicated. So she begins to experience subtle internal friction, not as crisis, but as awareness that something has to eventually shift in distribution. The film continues to keep everything grounded in everyday life. There are no exaggerated confrontations. Instead, there are small accumulations of realization, moments where she notices how quickly she has to switch emotional states, moments where she feels slightly delayed in one world because she was fully present in another, and those moments begin to build on each other. At home, nothing is explicitly said about her internal shift. Her family continues to operate under the assumption of continuity. Ruby is there. Ruby helps. Ruby translates. That continuity is deeply embedded, and because it has always worked, it is not questioned. But Ruby is no longer experiencing it as seamless continuity. She is experiencing it as structure she is beginning to see from the inside, and seeing structure changes how participation feels. At school, music continues to provide a space where she is not required to carry that structural awareness in the same way. She is allowed to focus on her own development, her own sound, her own progression. And that experience becomes increasingly distinct from her home experience, not as opposition, but as difference. And difference, once fully perceived, begins to influence how choices feel even before choices are made. At this stage of the story, Ruby is not moving toward a single decision. She is moving toward a point of recognition where she will eventually have to acknowledge that both worlds are asking for sustained versions of her that may not be fully compatible at maximum intensity, and that recognition is quietly, steadily forming beneath everything she does. As Ruby keeps living inside that quiet split, something very specific starts happening. She stops thinking of her life as what she does and starts feeling it as what she's holding at the same time. And holding things simultaneously, without dropping them, is where the emotional weight really settles. At home, the structure is still familiar, almost muscle memory at this point. Frank's world is still the sea and the grind of physical work that doesn't leave much space for reflection. Jackie still reads the emotional atmosphere of the household through expression, timing, and instinct. Leo still grows inside that same ecosystem, learning the same patterns of responsibility that have always defined their family life. And Ruby is still the point where all of that connects to the outside world. But now she understands that connection differently. It's no longer just helping, it's coordination across two systems that don't naturally communicate without her. And that realization doesn't create distance from her family in a dramatic sense. It creates awareness of function inside affection. At school, her musical life continues to deepen, not through sudden breakthroughs, but through repetition that slowly builds confidence into skill. Choir becomes a space where she starts recognizing not just sound, but control over sound. How breath, timing, and emotional intention combine into something that feels uniquely hers when it lands correctly. And every time that happens, it reinforces a different version of herself. Not a replacement version, a parallel one. That's what makes her situation so emotionally complex at this stage. She is not transitioning away from one identity into another. She is actively developing two identities that require different forms of presence, attention, and emotional energy. At home, identity is relational. At school, identity is expressive. Relational identity asks, how do you support the system you belong to? Expressive identity asks, what do you create from within yourself? And Ruby is now fully aware that she is operating inside both questions at once. That awareness changes the texture of even the smallest moments. A phone call from home isn't just communication anymore. It's an immediate shift in emotional state. A rehearsal isn't just practice, it's a full immersion into a different kind of self. Even transitions between spaces start to carry invisible weight, like she is constantly recalibrating who she needs to be depending on where she is standing. And recalibration takes energy. The film doesn't dramatize this exhaustion in obvious ways. There are no breakdown scenes or exaggerated emotional spikes. Instead, it shows how sustained mental switching begins to shape behavior subtly. Slight pauses, delayed responses, moments where she has to reorient herself before fully engaging. And over time, those small moments accumulate. At home, her family continues to operate under the assumption that Ruby's role is stable. Not because they are ignoring her growth, but because the system they've built together has always included her as a consistent point of translation and connection. For them, continuity equals stability. But Ruby is no longer experiencing continuity in the same way, because she now understands that continuity has been maintained through her constant availability. And availability, once seen clearly, stops feeling invisible. At school, her growth in music continues to introduce her to the idea that her voice has direction, not just capability, but trajectory. And trajectory implies future states that are not identical to present obligations. That idea begins to sit quietly in the background of her thoughts more often than she expects. Not as a plan, but as a possibility she can no longer fully unsee. And possibility, once it becomes visible, changes how present reality feels. Because present reality starts to feel like one version among several rather than the only structure available. The film continues to resist, turning this into a conflict between love and ambition, That's not what Ruby is experiencing. She is not choosing between caring for her family and pursuing music in a simple binary sense. She is navigating how much of herself can exist in each space without one continuously compressing the other. And compression is what she begins to feel more than conflict. At home, she compresses into responsibility. At school, she expands into expression. And switching between compression and expansion repeatedly begins to shape her emotional rhythm in a way that is hard to ignore internally. What makes this stage of her journey so grounded is that nothing external forces a decision. There is no dramatic ultimatum, no sudden rupture that demands immediate resolution. Instead, the pressure comes from accumulation of awareness. She starts noticing that her life is not divided by events, but by attention. And attention is the resource she is constantly redistributing without fully stepping back to evaluate the overall balance. That realization is subtle, but important. Because once you see distribution, you can no longer pretend everything is evenly integrated. At school, music continues to offer her something increasingly rare in her life, a space where her actions are not immediately tied to someone else's need. That autonomy begins to feel not like escape, but like a different mode of existence altogether. And experiencing that mode makes her more aware of how rare it is elsewhere. At home, autonomy is deeply interwoven with responsibility. Her independence is always contextual. Independent action still exists within a network of reliance. She can act freely, but her actions are always in relation to someone else's need or situation. And that relational structure is something she has never questioned until now. Not because it was restrictive, but because it was normal. And normal, when examined closely, often reveals structure you never had to consciously notice before. So Ruby finds herself in a space where nothing is wrong, nothing is broken, nothing is being rejected, but everything is becoming more defined. And definition is what eventually leads to choice, even if she hasn't made it yet. At this point in Ruby's life, the tension isn't about something coming anymore. It's about something already being here and slowly becoming impossible to ignore. Not in a dramatic, cinematic way. More like the way you suddenly realize a sound you've been hearing for hours was actually there the entire time. At home, the Rossi family still operates inside its long-established rhythm. Frank's connection to the sea remains the backbone of their livelihood, shaped by repetition and physical endurance rather than reflection. Jackie continues to hold the emotional balance of the household through a kind of intuitive reading of people and situations that doesn't rely on spoken language, but still carries precision. Leo continues to grow inside that structure, absorbing responsibility the way it has always been passed down in families like theirs, not through instruction, but through participation. And Ruby is still the central link between all of it and the outside world. But what's changed is how she understands that role. It's no longer just something she does. It's something she actively recognizes herself doing. That recognition is where the emotional shift becomes permanent. Because once a role becomes visible to the person performing it, it stops feeling like pure identity and starts feeling like function within a system. And systems can be analyzed. At school, her musical world continues to expand, not explosively, but steadily. Choir has become a space where she experiences a version of herself that is not structured around responsibility to others. In that environment, she is not translating, mediating, or interpreting. She is producing sound that exists for its own sake, and that difference is becoming more important to her than she initially expected. Not because she values one life over the other, but because she is beginning to understand that they require different versions of her attention. At home, attention is outward-facing, constantly responsive. At school, attention is inward-facing, increasingly self-directed. And switching between those two modes repeatedly is no longer effortless. It has weight now. The film is very careful not to turn this into emotional collapse or conflict-driven drama. Instead, it shows accumulation, small moments of internal recalibration that gradually reshape how Ruby experiences even routine situations. A simple request at home now requires her to mentally shift out of another headspace. A rehearsal at school requires her to mentally detach from responsibilities waiting elsewhere. And neither shift is clean. Both carry residue from the other. That residue is what builds tension. At home, her family still doesn't perceive her internal shift as something separate from normal growth. They see her becoming more involved in school, but within the framework of teenager exploring interests. They don't yet fully register the structural implication of what she is stepping into, because from their perspective, Ruby's role in the family system has remained functionally consistent. She is still the interpreter, still the connector, still the point where external communication passes through. And because that has always been true, it continues to feel stable from their side. But Ruby is now aware that stability is not the same as stasis. At school, the more she engages with music, the more she begins to recognize a different kind of internal structure forming, one that is not defined by obligation, but by development. Her voice is not just something she uses, it is something she is actively shaping. And shaping something requires time that cannot be simultaneously spent elsewhere. That realization is subtle, but it changes how she thinks about her days. Time is no longer just passing. It is being allocated. And allocation introduces consequence. Not immediate consequence in a dramatic sense, but cumulative consequence. How much presence is given here versus there. How much energy is invested in one direction versus another. The film keeps everything grounded in everyday experience while letting that internal math run in the background of every scene. There are no major external disruptions forcing her to choose. Instead, life continues normally, which is what makes the tension feel so realistic. Because in real life, most shifts don't arrive as events. They arrive as awareness of patterns you've already been living inside. Ruby starts to see that she has been operating as a stabilizing force in her family for so long that her absence, even briefly, has structural effects. Not emotional exaggeration, structural effects. And that distinction matters because it reframes her role from supporting family to integral communication system. At school, she is beginning to be seen not just as a participant, but as someone with potential direction. Not guaranteed success, not instant transformation, but a trajectory that others are starting to recognize. And trajectory always implies movement away from the present configuration towards something not yet fully defined. That implication sits quietly in her mind more and more often, not as pressure, but as awareness of possibility. And possibility, once it becomes real, changes how the present feels. Because the present is no longer the only version of life that exists in her understanding. She is now living inside overlap between what she has always been and what she is beginning to become. An overlap, by its nature, is temporary, even when it feels stable. That is where she is now, fully present in her life, but increasingly aware that her life is no longer singular in the way it once felt. At this stage, Ruby's life doesn't feel like it's moving toward a single, dramatic turning point. It feels like it's gradually becoming harder to ignore what's already been building underneath everything she does. And what's underneath isn't conflict in the loud sense. It's awareness of structure. At home, the Rossi family still carries on with its established rhythm, almost like muscle memory at this point. Frank continues to live through the demands of physical labor and routine tied to the fishing business, where each day is shaped by repetition, endurance, and familiarity with the sea. Jackie continues to hold the emotional center of the household with a kind of steady perceptiveness that comes from years of reading people without relying on sound. Leo continues to move deeper into that same system, slowly inheriting the same responsibilities, the same patterns of work, the same expectations that have always defined their family's survival.
And Ruby is still part of all of it. But what's changed is how she now experiences that participation. It's no longer automatic in her mind, it's conscious. And consciousness changes everything, even when the actions stay exactly the same. At school, her world in music continues to develop in a way that feels increasingly structured around growth rather than curiosity. Choir is no longer a space she simply enters and exits. It is becoming a place where she actively measures herself against improvement, refinement, and expression. Her voice is no longer something she finds in moments. It is something she practices into shape. And practice, unlike instinct, requires time. Time that now feels divided in a way she cannot unfeel. At home, she is still deeply embedded in the family system, still essential to communication between worlds, still relied upon in ways that are completely natural to everyone involved. But now she sees that reliance from a different angle, not as burden or complaint, but as structure she has been holding in place for years without naming it as such. And naming something internally changes how it feels externally. Because once you can identify your role within a system, you can no longer experience it as invisible. At school, she is beginning to experience something she rarely has elsewhere in her life: identity that is not defined by necessity. In music, she is not required to be a bridge for anyone else. She is not required to translate or mediate. She is allowed to exist as output rather than conduit. And that difference becomes increasingly significant to her emotional world. Not because she values one space over the other, but because the experience of self is different in each. At home, self is relational. At school, self is expressive. And those two versions of self are not in conflict, but they are not interchangeable either. The film continues to avoid simplifying this into a binary choice. There is no external pressure forcing her to abandon one world for the other. Instead, both worlds continue operating under the assumption that she belongs fully to each of them. And that assumption is what creates the quiet tension. Because Ruby is the only one fully aware of how divided her attention has become. She begins to notice how much mental effort it takes to switch between roles. Not physically switching locations, but emotionally and cognitively shifting between being interpreter, daughter, sister, and being singer, student, individual voice. Each shift carries an invisible cost. Not exhaustion in a dramatic sense, but fragmentation of focus. And fragmentation slowly starts to shape how she experiences her own continuity. At home, nothing about her family's behavior changes in any intentional way, but Ruby's awareness of their dependency on her communication role becomes more pronounced. She can see how naturally she fills gaps that others cannot easily fill, how instinctively she steps into moments where interpretation is needed, how quickly situations stabilize when she is present. And she also sees what happens when she is not immediately available. Not collapse, not crisis, but friction. Slight delays in understanding, slight pauses in communication, slight adjustments in how situations are handled without her immediate involvement. And those slights accumulate in her mind because she now recognizes their pattern. At school, her musical development continues to give her a contrasting experience of agency. She is learning what it means to shape something that does not exist without her participation. Her voice is becoming more intentional, more controlled, more expressive in ways that feel increasingly connected to her sense of self rather than her sense of obligation. And that connection begins to matter more than she expected, because it introduces a feeling she doesn't fully have at home: authorship. At home, she facilitates. At school, she creates. And creation carries a different emotional weight than facilitation. The film keeps this grounded in ordinary life. There are no dramatic declarations or sudden reversals, just the steady accumulation of awareness that she is living inside two systems that both feel real, both feel meaningful, but both require different versions of her presence. And presence, as she is beginning to understand, cannot be fully duplicated. It must be allocated. And allocation is where everything quietly begins to shift. She hasn't made a decision yet, but she is no longer unaware of the question forming underneath everything she does. At this point, Ruby's life has reached a place where nothing is dramatically changing on the surface, but almost everything is changing in how she internally registers it. And that distinction is really the emotional core of this stage of the story. At home, the Rossi family continues to operate inside its established structure. Frank's relationship with the sea remains steady and unshaken, shaped by repetition and necessity more than reflection. Jackie continues to hold the emotional and communicative balance of the household with a kind of quiet precision that doesn't rely on sound but still carries clarity. Leo continues to move deeper into the same inherited rhythm, slowly taking on more responsibility in a way that feels natural rather than forced. And Ruby is still the central connector within that system, but now she is also aware of being the connector. And awareness changes function into identity. That's the shift that quietly underpins everything happening inside her. At school, her life in music continues to grow in a way that feels increasingly structured around development rather than exploration. Choir is no longer something she participates in casually. It has become a space where she actively engages with discipline, repetition, correction, and expression. Her voice is not just something she uses anymore. It is something she is shaping. And shaping requires intention. That intention starts to separate her experience at school from her experience at home in a way that is not conflict, but contrast. At home, she is responsive. She reacts, translates, adjusts. Her presence is tied to immediate needs and communication gaps that require her involvement to function smoothly. At school, she is increasingly proactive. She chooses when to engage, how to refine, how to express. She is not filling gaps for others. She is building something that belongs to her. And that difference between responding and creating becomes more emotionally significant over time. The film stays very grounded in how this affects her day-to-day life. There is no dramatic rupture, no sudden confrontation forcing her into a decision. Instead, everything continues normally. Family life, school life, responsibilities, routines, while Ruby's internal awareness becomes more layered. And that layering is where tension begins to form, because she is no longer experiencing her life as a single continuous identity. She is experiencing it as overlapping roles that require different forms of attention. At home, her role is deeply embedded in structure. She is the interpreter between her family and the outside world. That role has always been present, but now she understands it more clearly, not just as emotional support, but as functional necessity. And recognizing necessity changes how responsibility feels. At school, she begins to experience something different. Identity that is not defined by what she does for others, but by what she produces from herself. And that difference creates internal contrast that she cannot fully ignore anymore. Not because one is better than the other, but because they require different versions of her attention, energy, and emotional presence. And those resources are not infinite. So she begins to feel more and more that she is constantly shifting between two modes of existence that don't fully align. One mode is relational, structured around others. The other is expressive, structured around self. And switching between those modes repeatedly starts to carry emotional weight she didn't previously name. At home, her family continues to function under the assumption that Ruby's presence is stable and continuous. Not in a demanding way, but in a foundational way. She is part of how communication happens with the outside world. That assumption has always been there, and because it has always worked, it remains unquestioned. But Ruby is now seeing the mechanics of that assumption more clearly. And seeing mechanics changes perception. At school, her musical development continues to introduce her to a version of herself that is not defined by obligation. In choir, she is not interpreting or mediating, she is expressing. And expression feels increasingly like a space where she exists without having to translate herself for anyone else. That experience becomes emotionally distinct enough that it starts to influence how she feels when she is not in it. Because once you experience a space where your voice is fully your own, other spaces begin to feel more structured by expectation. The film avoids turning this into a simple, emotional conflict. Ruby is not rejecting her family. She is not turning away from them. She is not framing music as escape or rebellion. Instead, she is living inside two fully valid systems that require different forms of participation, and the tension comes from trying to sustain both at full intensity, not because either is wrong, but because both are real. And reality, when doubled, creates pressure simply through coexistence. There are moments where Ruby becomes more aware of how quickly she has to mentally recalibrate when moving between environments. A call from home requires one kind of emotional posture. A rehearsal requires another. And those transitions are becoming more frequent, more noticeable, more mentally layered. Not dramatic, just cumulative. And cumulative experience is what slowly shapes her internal question. Not, what do I choose? But something closer to, how do I exist fully in both without something shifting? And that question doesn't have an answer yet, but it is now present in everything she does, even when nothing around her has visibly changed. At this stage, what really defines Ruby's journey is that nothing external needs to escalate anymore for the internal situation to feel intense. Everything around her still looks like normal life continuing at its usual pace. The Rossi household still wakes up early, still revolves around work, still communicates through familiar rhythms that have existed for years. Frank still carries the weight of physical labor and responsibility tied to the sea. Jackie still operates as the emotional interpreter of the family's environment, reading situations through expression and instinct with a kind of practiced precision. Leo still grows into the same structure, learning what it means to belong to a working family, where effort is not optional, it's inherited, and Ruby is still there in the middle of it. But now she is also seeing the middle more clearly than she ever has before. That's the shift that quietly defines everything. At school, her life in music continues to expand, not through sudden breakthroughs or dramatic recognition, but through steady repetition that slowly builds her identity around sound, discipline, and expression. Choir is no longer something she attends. It is something she actively participates in shaping herself through. Her voice becomes more controlled, more intentional, but also more emotionally connected to her sense of self. And that connection is important because it starts to differentiate her experience in a way she can't ignore. At home, she is essential to communication. She translates, mediates, and stabilizes interaction between two worlds that don't naturally overlap. At school, she is expressive. She creates, refines, and develops something that belongs only to her. And that difference is no longer abstract. It is lived. The film doesn't turn this into a conflict-driven arc. There is no breaking point yet, no confrontation that demands resolution. Instead, everything continues as usual, while Ruby's internal awareness becomes increasingly layered. And layering is where emotional complexity begins to build, because she is now holding two fully developed modes of being at once. One is relational, defined by responsibility, connection, and translation. The other is individual, defined by expression, growth, and voice. Neither is temporary anymore. Both are becoming stable parts of her identity, and stability in two different directions creates tension without requiring external drama. At home, her role continues to function smoothly, but she now perceives the structure behind that smoothness. She sees how much depends on her immediate availability. She sees how naturally she fills gaps that others cannot easily fill. She sees how communication flows through her in ways that have become completely normalized over time, and noticing that changes how she experiences even simple interactions, because what once felt like participation now feels like maintenance, not in a negative sense, but in a structural sense. At school, music continues to offer her something fundamentally different, a space where she is not required to stabilize anything for anyone else. She is not translating meaning. She is producing it. She is not interpreting sound for others. She is shaping it from within herself. And that shift from interpreter to creator becomes increasingly emotionally significant. Not because she values one over the other more, but because they demand different versions of her presence. And presence, once divided, becomes something she has to consciously manage. That management begins to shape her daily rhythm. Transitions between home and school are no longer seamless emotional shifts. They require recalibration. She has to mentally move from one identity structure to another, and each transition carries a small cost in focus and energy. Not exhaustion in a dramatic way, but fragmentation. And fragmentation, when repeated, becomes awareness of limitation. The film continues to stay grounded in everyday life. There are no sudden revelations or external shocks forcing change. Instead, there's accumulation of understanding, of contrast, of internal differentiation. At home, nothing is wrong. The system still works. But Ruby now understands that it works because she is consistently part of its functioning structure. At school, nothing is extraordinary, but she is beginning to recognize that her experience there is not just participation, it is development of identity that does not depend on anyone else's interpretation. And that difference is what slowly becomes emotionally unavoidable, because she is no longer only living her life. She is beginning to see how her life is organized. And once organization becomes visible, it starts to influence how you move inside it. That's where she is now. Not at a decision, not at a rupture, but at a point of awareness where everything she does carries both immediate meaning and structural implication at the same time. And that dual meaning is quietly shaping what comes next. At this point in Ruby's life, what's most striking is how normal everything still looks on the outside, even while her internal experience has become something far more layered than it used to be. There's no visible disruption in her day-to-day world. The Rossi household still operates with the same rhythm it has always had. Frank still goes out early, tied to the demands of the sea and the physical reality of fishing life. Jackie still functions as the emotional interpreter of the household, reading situations with a kind of intuitive clarity that doesn't depend on sound, but still captures meaning with precision. Leo still continues moving into adulthood inside the same structure, learning responsibility through repetition rather than explanation. And Ruby is still central to all of it. But now she understands what central actually means in practice. And that understanding quietly changes everything. At school, her life in music continues to grow in a way that feels increasingly structured around refinement rather than discovery. Choir is no longer just an activity. It's becoming a disciplined space where her voice is shaped, tested, adjusted, and strengthened through repetition. And with each layer of improvement, she starts to experience something she didn't fully have before, a sense of authorship over her own expression. Her voice is no longer just something she has. It is something she actively develops. And development requires time, attention, and consistency, which means it begins to compete, quietly but steadily, with the time and attention her family life also requires. The film doesn't frame this as conflict. There's no sudden opposition between her home and her music. Instead, both continue to exist as fully valid parts of her life, both continuing to assume her availability in their own way. And that assumption is where the emotional complexity starts to build, because Ruby is no longer operating under a single unified sense of self that moves effortlessly between environments. She is now consciously aware of how much she has to shift internally depending on where she is. At home, she is interpreter, connector, stabilizer. At school, she is voice, student, developing artist. Neither role is fake. Neither role is temporary. Both are real and active, but they require different emotional postures. And switching between those postures repeatedly begins to carry a subtle weight that accumulates over time. At home, nothing about her role changes externally. She still translates conversations. She still mediates interactions with the outside world. She still steps in when communication becomes complex or requires immediate interpretation. But internally, she now sees the structure of that role more clearly than she ever has before. She sees how much of the family's interaction with the outside world flows through her without hesitation. She sees how naturally she has become the point of connection, and seeing that changes how she feels inside it. Not because she resents it, but because she understands it. And understanding structure is different from simply living inside it. At school, her experience continues to move in the opposite direction. Music gives her a space where she is not required to interpret or stabilize anything for anyone else. She is allowed to exist in expression without mediation. That experience begins to feel increasingly distinct, not as escape, but as contrast. And contrast is what slowly reshapes perception. The more she experiences that difference, the more she becomes aware of how divided her attention actually is becoming. Not in a distracted sense, but in a structural sense. How her time is distributed, how her emotional energy is allocated, how her sense of self is shaped differently depending on where she is. At home, attention is outward-facing, always responsive, always connected to someone else's need or communication gap. At school, attention is increasingly inward-facing, focused on her own development, her own sound, her own progression, and moving between those two modes is no longer effortless. It requires adjustment every time. And adjustment, when repeated enough, becomes awareness of limitation. The film continues to avoid dramatic escalation. There is no single event forcing a decision. No confrontation that suddenly defines everything. Instead, everything continues normally, while Ruby's internal awareness becomes more detailed, more precise, and more difficult to ignore. She is not being pushed out of one world or pulled into another. She is beginning to see both worlds clearly at the same time. And that simultaneous clarity is where tension naturally forms. Because once you see how something is structured, you can no longer fully experience it as invisible. At home, her family still operates under the assumption that her role is stable, not because they are unaware of her growth, but because their lived experience of her presence has always been consistent and reliable. She has always been there to translate, to connect, to bridge. And continuity, for them, feels like stability. But Ruby is beginning to understand that continuity is not the same as balance. At school, her musical development continues to hint at trajectory, not immediate transformation, but direction. A sense that her voice is moving towards something that exists beyond the present moment. And trajectory introduces the idea that the present is not the only possible version of her life. That idea begins to quietly sit in the background of everything she does, not as a decision, but as awareness. And awareness, once fully present, always changes how the next step feels, even before that step